Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, before we even get into this, two things. Firstly, this is going to be an incredibly nerdy video, okay? But secondly, we're likely to be dealing with some fairly subtle tonal changes. So if you want to get the most out of this comparison, please listen back on some decent studio speakers or a good set of headphones. If you're listening on a little iPhone speaker, you're not likely to hear very much at all. So please use some good playback speakers if you want to really hear the subtle changes we're going to be dealing with today. Now, this here is my 1992 Gibson Les Paul Standard, a wonderful guitar. It's the so-called good wood era of Gibson. And over the years, I've modified this guitar to be as close to burst spec as is realistic to achieve with this particular instrument. So I've got throwback SLE 101 PAF replicas in, some of the finest PAF replicas you can buy. I've got vintage original Central Lab pots in here, or at least the innards of the original pots, with a 50s wiring schematic, paper and oil bumblebee capacitors, all of the good stuff. So it's as close to a burst as this guitar is ever really going to be anyway. But when tone chasing those classic Gibson tones, there's one element of the guitar that's very often been overlooked, and that is the ABR-1 bridge. Now, just to cover this quickly, this guitar of course had a Nashville bridge when I bought it, being a 90s guitar. So to use a vintage correct ABR-1, I am using the Royal Mount adapter posts. So we have soft brass thumb wheels, exactly like the originals would have been, but I'm using the kind of plug inserts to kind of fit it into this particular guitar. So it's not going to sound exactly like a burst because it doesn't have that construction technique, all of that stuff, but it's as close as I can get with this guitar. And this is reality for a lot of people. Not everybody has £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 for a custom shop R8 or R9. So I am using the adapter post today for this video. But for the longest time, the ABR-1 of choice for me has been the Faber. And the main reason for that is there's a gentleman over in the United States called Dave Stevens. He's very well known for his kind of top shelf PAF replicas. Sadly, I don't have a set here. They're just too difficult to get hold of. I'd love to own a set, but unfortunately I don't. But Dave has a YouTube channel and he's done a video series, I think it was called The Les Paul That Isn't, or words to that effect. And he went through all aspects of modern custom shop Gibson Les Pauls and kind of analysed whether they were vintage correct or not. And the end result was most of the hardware, at least, isn't really anywhere close to what would have been on the original guitars. The materials are different, the construction's different, the look is different, all of it. So he kind of pulled it all apart and, analysed what's wrong with modern custom shop Les Pauls. And as part of that, he said he's very often asked what the most vintage correct ABR-1 bridge is. And until very recently, he's tended to say none of them are particularly vintage correct, but the Faber sounds pretty good. And that's the reason I now use Faber ABR-1s on all of my Gibson and Gibson style guitars, is on Dave's recommendation. But all that changed a couple of years ago because a new bridge hit the market from a company called Four Uncles Restorations. Now, I don't know anything about three of the uncles, but one of them is Dave Stevens himself, who's a real authority on all of this sort of stuff. And essentially what the Four Uncles bridge is it's not just a replica of an old ABR-1, it's a clone, down to the most minute detail. So all of the dimensions are absolutely dead on. And they took original 50s ABR-1s and destroyed them to analyse the actual alloys used. The Zamac for the case, the soft brass for the saddles. It's not just off-the-shelf brass that you can buy nowadays. It's all been custom mixed to the exact ratios that were used back in the 1950s. So it's nerdy to the nth degree, but it's said to be as accurate and sonically accurate as it's possible to get to an original ABR-1. So I've now got the Four Uncles bridge on this Les Paul. But what I didn't do was an A-B comparison between the Four Uncles and the Faber. So I was going to make a video doing that comparison, but then I also thought, There are other aftermarket ABR-1s out there that are held in very high regard, so maybe I should include those in this comparison as well. So today I'm going to do a 4-way ABR-1 comparison. I'm going to compare the Faber to the Four Uncles, but also include the stock custom shop Gibson ABR-1 and the Callaham ABR-1. Now, the Callaham's a little bit different. It's not going after vintage accuracy whatsoever. It's made from cold rolled steel, which is kind of Callaham's thing. So it's giving you an alternative and a so-called improvement on those old bridges. It's not going after vintage accuracy, but it's held in very high regard. A lot of people love the Callaham bridge on their Les Pauls, so it's absolutely worthy of including that in this comparison. And I'm going to put all 4 bridges on this Les Paul. I'm going to make sure the setup is identical for all of them. I think the dimensions are the same, but it's all going to be checked. The distance between the pickup and the bottom of the string will be exactly the same. The action of the guitar isn't going to change whatsoever. And I'm just going to do some clean playing and some kind of low to medium gain cranked plexi Marshall playing, which is where people who are really into their sort of burst spec guitars most stereotypically live, is that kind of cranked Clapton plexi thing. And just see what tonal changes the 4 bridges can create in this guitar. Because the Four Uncles bridge is very expensive, very hard to come by. Something like the Faber is much more readily available. And of course, if you buy a sort of £4,000, £5,000, £7,000 Gibson custom shop Les Paul, it will come with the stock bridge. How does that compare to as close to the real deal as it's possible to get? So I thought there's a lot of interesting elements to this video, so I wanted to shoot the comparison today. So without further ado, folks, here we go. So there we are, folks. Now please do comment underneath, let me know what you were hearing today. Which of those bridges was your favourite? Which did you think gave my guitar more of what you associate with classic burst tone? I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks down in the comments section. Now, we were indeed dealing with fairly subtle tonal changes today, weren't we? Going between those 4 bridges, it was still my guitar, it sounded like my guitar, just with a few subtle differences. So it wasn't like going to a completely different style of pickup or anything like that. It was, broadly speaking, ballpark. But that said, there were some important differences to note between the 4 bridges. Now, first and foremost, I think that Dave has been absolutely on the money over the years by saying that the Faber bridge, and this is assuming that the 4 Uncles is as sonically accurate to the originals as it says it is, which I think it probably is. The Faber might not be vintage correct in terms of its materials and its construction technique, but sonically it sounds very, very close to the 4 Uncles. But I think the 4 Uncles had a little bit more kind of top end on it. It sounded slightly more harmonically rich, alive, and a little bit kind of sweeter on the top end. That's the phrase I want to use. It's a woolly adjective that means nothing, but it had a slightly more kind of sweet tone and balanced tone across its entire frequency range. But the Faber did sound very, very close to it. Now, the Callaham and the Gibson were more substantially different in that they were both a little bit louder somehow. When I was using the Z-Rec today, I had it set kind of edge of break up and down a little bit, so it was as loud as I could get it without it really breaking up. But the Gibson and the Callaham bridges seem to be nudging the amp slightly more into compression than the other two. But more than that, they were both brighter than the Faber and the 4 Uncles, but in slightly different ways. It was interesting to hear how they compared. To my ears, the Callaham had a little bit more treble on the top end, the sort of glassy brightness frequencies. And Callaham do say that those bridges give you a piano-like top end, which kind of ties in with that. But the Gibsons seem to have a little bit more upper mid-range to it, that kind of 1, 2, 3 sort of scratchy upper mids thing. And it sounds a little bit more lo-fi overall. That's the phrase I want to use. It had a kind of sort of aggressive upper mids going on compared to the others. So they were more substantially different. Overall, I would say, to my ears, and this is just my sort of opinion on this, I think the Gibson bridge sounded the least like what I would associate with burst tone out of all of those bridges. The Callaham did sound a fair bit brighter than the 4 Uncles and the Faber, but that might be what you need. If you have a sort of slightly dull sounding 335, for example, and you want to add a little bit more kind of pizzazz on the top end to bring it to life, the Callaham might be exactly what you want. But if you have a bright guitar and a bright amp rig, that top end might be a little bit too much. So it's not necessarily bad in any way, shape or form. To me, it was a little bit too bright, but that's because I have a bright sounding guitar and a bright rig. Generally speaking, I like the top end, and it was giving me a little bit too much of that, but it could be exactly what you want, even though it's not vintage correct in terms of its materials. So I do think the Faber and the 4 Uncles definitely sounded more vintagey to me in terms of what I associate with that sound. And I'm not just saying this because it was very expensive and I bought it, but the 4 Uncles was my personal favourite. It had that kind of warmth but sweet top end and clankiness going on, and a bit more dynamic range, especially compared to the Callaham and the Gibson. And it just sounded that kind of 2% more to me like recordings I've heard over the years of real burst guitars. So it does seem to kind of give you a little bit more of that. But that said, the Faber is about 1/5 of the price, much more readily available, and it can get pretty damn close to how the 4 Uncles sounds. But as always, folks, those are just my thoughts, so please do let me know yours underneath. I'm really keen to get your feedback on this video and find out what you thought of these 4 bridges today. I think that would be really interesting. But thank you ever so much for watching, folks. I hope this video is interesting and useful for you. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it makes a big difference when you hit subscribe. And I will see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.